again. Welcome back to Procurement and Supply Chain live in New York. Now for our next panel, and that's the Supply Chain Sustainability Forum, sponsored by Cooper. And we've got a wonderful panel with you for this. I'll just go through to introduce them all. We have Chandan Trehan, Lead Digital Supply Chains at Bosch, Javette Hines, Director, Head of Supply Chain Development, Inclusion and Sustainability at Citi, and Madison Gunter, VP of Procurement Programs, Supplier Governance and Compliance at Salesforce. Hello to all of you. Great to see you all.
Hello, how are you?
Hi there. Thank you so much. Yeah, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had a fantastic show so far, and we've got an awful lot to get through over the next 40 minutes or so. So this is the Supply Chain Sustainability panel, and this is a subject that could be a whole show on its own, so we're going to do our best to get it into 40 minutes. So where shall we start from? Let's start with some supplier selection discussions, because that is such a key part of it. Chandan, I'll start with you. You're the first name on my list, so you have the pleasure of opening things. What I'd love to know is how you go about integrating sustainability criteria into supplier selection to make sure there's ethical and environmental responsible practice.
Thank you. I think, first of all, thank you so much for having us here. It's a wonderful day and I'm loving it. I think one of the most important aspects of integrating sustainability in your supply chain decision is to plan for action collaboratively. There's never enough stress that can be given to collaboration and the importance of collaboration in sustainability. The good or the bad thing about sustainability is no one person, one organization, one region can solve this problem alone. It has to be a collaborative effort that comes in and brings in multiple people together. Sustainability has to be baked in the processes and in the organization's mindset, and it has to be baked as early as possible in the process. So we have to make sure that we work with the suppliers, define those definitive goals that they are also signing in for, and work with them to bridge the sustainability gaps that we see in their systems. So it's not one company trying to solve this, but it's a collaborative effort of the OEMs, the suppliers, and everybody coming together. The other important aspect around this is leveraging technology as much as possible and wherever possible, because that's something that's going to make sure that the right kind of data is collected. And finally, include the easier part is to include sustainability in your supplier assessment and supplier onboarding process, so that in future, as you keep onboarding more and more suppliers, you eventually move to the ones that are more sustainable and the ones that are more committed to making sure that the materials that are being used or the services that are being provided are more biosensitive, biosustainable. So those are my few cents on that.
Chandan, thank you very much indeed. And what I always love about these kind of panels is bringing different people together from very different industries. So we're going to a more financial aspect here. Javette Hines at Citi, thank you so much for joining us. I'll stick with supplier selection with you here, about integrating sustainability criteria into that. How do you go about that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think much of what Chandan has shared, of course, is understanding that one size does not fit all. So it really is a matter of trying to understand who our suppliers are within the supply chain, and also taking a look from a global perspective, from a risk tier perspective. Where do our suppliers fit as it relates to risk, whether it is based on, risk tiers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on how a company looks at it. But the other piece of the integration is also looking at what kind of risk we're looking at and exactly what is it that we're looking at from a supply chain sustainability. When it comes to modern slavery, human rights, as an example, there are some very specific regulatory requirements that are in place. And so we want to make sure that we understand, one, what those are and the countries in which we're doing business, and making sure that, one, we are paying attention to those regulatory considerations, but also the suppliers with whom we do business, that they understand those things. And then the other piece of it is really taking a look across the firm already to figure out what from a practice and policy do we already have in place that's addressing risk broadly, and to ensure that even if we're saying, okay, now we're focused on supply chain sustainability and ESG, where the alignment is. And that way we make sure that we have a program, a process that aligns fully with what a corporation says is important to it overall, and that our risk mitigation and risk identification, the plans start to also align and are very clear to everyone. And there is no lacking of understanding from either internally or working with our suppliers with whom we do business. So I think that's what we have to take into consideration when we're talking about integrating supply chain sustainability in the overall process.
Javette, thank you very much. I love how you've broken that down and the real focus there on clarity there, which is so important. Madison Gunter, we'll come to you last on this. I appreciate many of the points you may have made may already have been brought up by your federal panelists, so going third is never easy. But anything you'd like to add?
Absolutely. So I think the only thing that I would add in addition to what my colleagues have already said is that it's important when you're looking at, from a tactical standpoint, to strategize on impact. And that for us is one of the biggest issues. So, not only looking at it from a high level and how we're going to processize it, but also look at what suppliers and how we segment those suppliers to give us the biggest impact as we move forward. Because most of us know that when you have a supply chain and you're trying to introduce something that's fairly new or different and in a transitional stage, it's you want to do first, what is the impacts going to happen within the near term and in the long term, right? And so when we plug in all of these things that, like I said, my colleagues have said, especially from onboarding and those who are already in the supply chain, who's going to impact the most? How do we help work with them? And even in some points, how do we develop them? We may need to help along the way, right? For the bigger, the greater good, I should say, not the bigger, but the greater good. So that would be the only thing that I would add to that.
Madison, you've picked up on one of the key words that just keeps on coming up through the show today. One of them has been about being effective and effectiveness, and the other is very much about impact, as you were saying there. Let's move on. We've got plenty of subjects I want to cover off today, and obviously the event today has a strong US focus. But let's broaden our horizons a little further, because there are key challenges when implementing sustainable practices within the really complex global supply chains that we have now. How on earth do we go about navigating those? Because the challenges, I guess, have not been greater in many years. Javette, I'll come to you first on this. What are those key challenges, and how do you go about overcoming those complex global supply chains?
I think some of it, in terms of navigating complex challenges, a little of it goes back to what I shared earlier. It's really understanding the regulatory landscape also. Of course, we have to take a look at, again, my example for me, because it's something I look at a lot, modern slavery and human rights as an example. Where currently are there modern slavery and human rights statements that exist, and what are the reporting requirements that have to also be considered? And then certainly post-pandemic, taking a look at, some of the health concerns, some of the economic concerns and or challenges with respect to people not necessarily working, but now perhaps they are, different things are happening. So where is it then that you take a look at, have there been certain countries, regions, and or clusters where there has been a rise as it relates to modern slavery, human rights, forced labor, child labor? So really taking a look and being very intentional about understanding within our supply chain particular countries from a global slavery, modern slavery index, but then also looking at categories and commodities. Are there certain categories that, you might see some of those things more so than the other? And at the same time, I think partnering and collaborating a bit, one of the things we've been able to do over the past couple of years for me is, because of other third-party organizations that we belong to, is really sharing best practices. How do some of my colleagues take a look at environmental social governance? And what is it that they're prepared to think about as it relates to scope 1, 2, and or 3, as it relates to ESG or supply chain sustainability, as it relates to climate risk and, potential business disruptions. Again, we've all gone through a global pandemic, and so we learned a lot from it and we were able to pivot. But then as we think about earthquakes and other things, like we had an earthquake in New York about a month ago, how do we all begin to look at those things? And again, as you stated, some part of our discussion is US, but we have to be focused globally. So then it's a matter of also partnering with other companies who might be either our customers and or suppliers, but partnering to share information, look at metrics, of course, look at requirements, and then make sure that we're aligned and intentional. And I think the other part of it, to me, also has been taking a look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Where is it that as we look at some of those goals, is there alignment and where we can think to be more integrated in our process, but also just more intentional to understand globally where pockets of change are happening and where we need to think about them as we identify not just risk within our supply chain, within our firms, but also opportunities to enhance what it is we're doing, and then at the same time continue to drive value.
Javette, you're absolutely forensic in how you've picked that apart. That's beautifully done. Madison, if I can come to you next on that. Some of those challenges, particularly with an eye on implementing sustainable practices within those global supply chains.
Yeah, so it's no secret that we have big jobs, especially if you're looking from a global standpoint. And folks don't always think about us having a big job. I think there's some key things that need to happen from a again, back to a tactical, practical standpoint. One is we don't always have the resources globally. If we had resources globally, we could do these jobs. Most of us could do these jobs a little more seamlessly, but what ends up happening is, quite honestly, is we have to internally partner, as Javette said, and externally partner. When I say internally partner, I work with legal, I work with the sales team, because I just don't have touch points everywhere. And there are so many things that are going on from the standpoint of sustainability, ESG as a whole, human rights, like has been said. And in addition to that, we try to partner with as many organizations internally that we think would be a benefit to Salesforce as possible. So those are the kind of key things that we start off with. Other things that we try to make sure that we're covering and bonding over is our key stakeholders, like leaders. So what we do is we connect with our leaders, say in India or Asia, Australia, and so on, to make sure that we do have some type of coverage, right? And again, that coverage is systematically spreads across our supply chain. So any of the suppliers that we have in country or I should say in region, we try to make sure that we have adequate coverage. And a lot of times those people don't report to us. They are just partners, and we try to make the best we can of it. And the last thing I'll say around this is that, as we move forward, and this is a great opportunity to say that, is, anytime that folks in the audience or my colleagues have those opportunities to share and partner, Salesforce is totally open to it.
Thank you very much indeed, Madison. Chandan, we'll come to you on that same question about those key challenges and implementing sustainable practice through a global supply chain.
Thank you. I think Madison and Javed have very wonderfully covered most of the point, except maybe I'll just add one small point from my side. Often one of the most underrated aspects in these kind of transformation programs, sustainability and transformation programs cutting across the globe, is the cultural aspect. The willingness to adopt a new technology is going to be different based on the different cultures where people are coming from. More often than not, the definition of sustainability, definition of what is ethical, definition of what is socially right to be done may also vary from one region to another. So there is a lot of ground coverage that needs to be done in those aspects as well, making sure that while there are very regional, very specific regulatory norms that are being set up, how do we make sure that they translate in a manner that there's a global standard that everybody understands and adheres to as well. And a lot of that has got to do with bridging those cultural gaps and cultural barriers that we see. So I think that's one of the most underrated aspects. Sometimes we do not cover that as a part of that. So that's just wonderful point in addition to what Madison and Chavez said.
Absolutely, Chandan. As Madison was saying about the size of our jobs, it'd be so much easier if everyone's definition of sustainability was the same, but it's not, so that just adds an extra layer of complication for everything we're trying to do. Let's move on to a bit of technology discussion here, and I want to throw this wide open because there's so many different aspects to that, so you can all explore whichever areas of it you like. From all of your experience, there's plenty of experience around this virtual table, if you like. What kind of difference has technology made in helping with sustainability within supply chain? I'll start with you on this, Madison.
Thanks. So I can pick out probably a number of different things, but something that I'll make very visual. We tried early on to look at, okay, what different product sets within house that we have would support our initiatives, right? And initially, you know, we at Salesforce have a set of products, but they didn't fit. They weren't cohesive. So what we did is we started looking at other, and I don't want to give any commercials, but we started looking at other third-party, what I call service providers that have specific technologies, new technologies. Again, I don't want to give any commercials here. New technologies that we thought would apply to what we're trying to do globally. So one of the areas that we found was instrumental is that in our onboarding process, we were able to conduct with a third-party technology company to support our surveys on the onboarding part that would allow us to be seamless as we brought on new suppliers to fit our initiative. And some of those initiatives would fall into things like what we have as exhibits, where when we bring on a supplier, we automatically introduce certain criterias around our initiatives that may be diversity or sustainability, what have you, and the supplier would then sign on to that prior to becoming a full-fledged supplier of Salesforce. But the technology piece, just to kind of like, again, give you a small example, the technology piece allowed us to do that seamlessly and quickly. Because as most of you know, onboarding, as I own that also, onboarding is a big deal from a supply chain standpoint, especially if you have companies like ours that, you know, you have business holders who need, you know, product service yesterday. So again, that's one of the examples that we were able to use.
Only yesterday. I thought it was sometimes the day before yesterday, so no pressure at all. Chandan, well, let's move on quickly there before we put our foot in it. Chandan, we'll come to you next on that same question. The technology progress you've seen and the help it provides when it comes to sustainable supply chains. What's your perspective on that?
I think, like I said in one of the earlier responses, technology is going to play a very critical role in making sure that we adhere to these kind of standards and regulatory requirements that are coming up. I see very prominent role that AI, Gen AI, etc. are playing in this space. I was talking to one of our customers just a few days ago, and they were talking about how Gen AI is being used to identify alternate, more sustainable material, so that, you know, they can start using that in their manufacturing process. It is going to make sure that this material is going to be more, it is going to be better suited for circular economies and that kind of stuff. So that's a very interesting take of how technology is helping in the sustainability space. Needless to say, all the existing technology space around, you know, reducing risk in your supply chains, doing better demand management, demand forecasting, so that you do not end up overproducing stuff, resource optimization, making sure that you're using less fuel in delivering the same amount of product. All those things put together are playing a very critical role when it comes to sustainability. Blockchain, on the other hand, is one big technology that I think is going to transform the way sustainability is being looked at today. Making sure that there is end-to-end provenance, right kind of sourcing is being done. You have a better visibility of how your supply is sourcing some of your material and some more services is going to be very critical. So I would say that it's going to be a mix of these technologies. And when I talk about technologies, I always suggest is we should approach technology and its impact with a little bit of guarded optimism. I don't think there is one technology or a group of technologies alone that can solve all these problems. We have to make sure, any technology for that matter, if there are enough number of people who want it to fail, it's going to fail. So we haven't really gotten to a point where technology can overpower humans. But that being said, we have to make sure that the cultural aspect is also taken into account. The right set of technology choices are also taken into account, rather than just going after one technology or fancy technology, being enamored by those technology terms alone in the process.
Absolutely. And Javette, I'll come to you very, very quickly on this, because I appreciate many of the points will have been made. I'll throw this technology question wide open to you. In your experience, it must give so many more opportunities for sustainable practice within supply chain.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say, Shandon said guarded optimism. So I think that's the thing. I think when we start out initially, we started with a lot of in-house things and they seem great. And then, of course, as we've already said, from a regulatory perspective, different metrics, we start to look externally. So the good news is there are many different vendors that are, coming into play, and we have the opportunity to kind of source and ideally find the right ones. But I think there is this guarded optimism, because at the end of the day, it may not be just one. It could be 2 or 3 that we all have to consider, depending on the industry and some of the things that have been shared.
Absolutely. Thank you, Javette. Let's move on to talk about...
Can I just say one more thing?
Absolutely. Carry on.
Although we all agree that technology can be a bonus here, I'm an advocate for, but I also don't believe in blind technology. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear here on my perspective. Blind technology of someone not monitoring or looking at it from an optimistic look is great, but from looking at it from what can it do and what downsides it may have, and continuously looking at it to support operations within. I just wanted to make sure that was a point that was put out there, because clearly a lot of times folks will say, oh yeah, technology, and run with that, but that doesn't always mean that it's the best scenario.
Absolutely. You can have the shiniest new toy, as I always say, but if you don't use it properly and if you don't give it the right information, then who knows what's going to happen next. So you've got to use these things intelligently. Thank you for that, Madison. That is a really important point. Where I want to take things next is something we've touched on a few times, and that is about partners, suppliers, your whole ecosystem when it comes to collaboration, because you can have the best set of strategies to try and improve the sustainability of your supply chain. You can only do so much. Your partners, your procurement network absolutely has to play ball and be part of that journey with you, or it could be a bit like talking to yourself, which no one really wants to do at the best of times. So I'll start with you, Chandan, on this one. The advice you have, how do you get your supply chain partners to buy into what you're doing and become an active and progressive part of that?
I think one thing that we in business have understood probably a little hard way is that there is no zero-sum game. It has to be a win-win strategy, and it's never that you are going to win against a supplier, you are going to win with the supplier. So when you are talking to your suppliers and trying to onboard them on your sustainability plan, first of all, it's not your sustainability plan alone. It's a sustainability plan that everybody who is a part of your value stream has to agree and buy into. I think the benefits that sometimes we often talk about when we do these kind of programs with our suppliers and our downstream partners, is that the innovation lead times get reduced significantly. Co-innovation is one of the big areas where we see that there is a lot of synergies that can be brought in. See, this is a new space. A lot of new technology interplay has to come in. A lot of new things are going to be experimented. And some of those things, no matter how much or how hard we try, are bound to fail. So if there are collaborations that are brought in, sometimes the overall lead times can reduce significantly. It can be as simple as learning and sharing practices that have worked and have not worked in the past with the supplier as well. So there is a win-win situation for your supplier to become a part of this as well. When I'll not take any names or examples here, but when an organization, say, starts integrating more closely with their upstream partners, say an agricultural company looking at integrating with the farmers directly or the producers directly, it does not necessarily just improve the lives of those farmers or those producers alone. It also in turn brings in benefit for the organization that is doing that program. So it's a very mutual synergistic model that we have to make sure that we are looking into. It has to be a win-win situation, and oftentimes when you present it that way to your suppliers, to your partners, to your downstream and upstream partners, they are more than happy to become a part of this collaborative exercise. So I think that's one of the key areas that you want to make sure to increase collaboration and partnerships.
That's a wonderful mindset about winning together. Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. Javette, if we can come to you next on this, your advice from your experience, getting partners on board, getting that supply chain on board to make sure you're realising what you have on paper to really improve the sustainability of your supply chain.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think some of it goes back again to looking internally, because I think Shannon just made the point also that this ESG or supply chain sustainability, while not new, there's some aspects that are new. And so it does require, understanding in terms of, where it is it fits from a supply chain perspective when we're looking at supply chain sustainability, where it might fit in a corporate realty services area, which may not be a part of procurement. Where does it fit on a corporate sustainability ESG? So all these different pockets within a firm or corporation, we want to understand how each of us may be ideally looking at ESG. And then, of course, the procurement piece from a supplier perspective, what are the expectations so that we are educating ourselves to all make sure here's how we're looking at it, here's what we say at the corporate level, here are our supplier expectations, and then think about what are the quarterly business reviews that we have in place, what are our customers asking for, so that at least we have an alignment in terms of education, awareness, being on the same page. And then as it relates to our suppliers, whether it's talking about the quarterly business reviews or other ways that we're either onboarding suppliers or looking at ongoing monitoring and due diligence, there has to be some meeting of the minds in terms of, again, what is the definition of what we say is important to us? What's the education and training that needs to come into play? And then how does it align, again, with either risk that we need to make sure that we are preventing and or mitigating, and or also from a cost perspective, what will be required, technology or otherwise, for us to consider to make sure that we are eliminating risk and or challenges as we are working together with one another. Because again, back to the newness piece, some of this may not have been budgeted for, and we have to put out budgeting is a big deal when you're talking resources. So these are the additional things I think when we talk about them as partners and collaborators, it helps us to make sure that we are aligned internally as well as externally with our suppliers if certain costs are passed on to them as well.
Absolutely. Alignment, again, clarity. There's regular things that are coming up here. Madison, if we come to you last on this one, enlighten us. How do you go about that? How do you get those partners on board, singing from the same hymn sheet and doing exactly what you would really need them to do to fit into your sustainability strategy with your supply chain?
Absolutely. So the first thing I'll say is I look at it from the long and coming back in, right? And what's going to make the biggest impact? And when I do that is the body of work, what's going to support that? And I use it as a stool, like a four-legged stool, right? So there's my teams who manages and kind of quarterbacks this whole thing. But then we also look at internally, we look at the business owners. What are their needs? And then how do we support them and they support us to get to our goal? The second part is sourcing, the sourcing entity itself. how are they educated? How are they moving forward? So you don't have to continually train them, but they understand that we have goals out here, and guess what? We're going to do as much as we can, and then we have a quarterback to look back at. I guess that's a very American scenario, but we have a quarterback to look back at how do we conduct things, right? The third area I would say is, the fourth area I would say is external partners. Who and what do we need external outside of the company that may be an advantage for us or help us develop? And that's what we do. So if we go back to the business owner, like I said, they have to be aware, they have to understand this is the goal and this is what we're doing and what we want to do as we gather new and support suppliers and vendors that are already on. The sourcing organization, we have to continually educate them, let them know where we are, push towards our goal, and prompt them up, highlight them. That's very big to make sure when they do something well as an organization, this is a team effort. And then the last thing is, hey, we may not be able to do all this internally. We got to go out and find someone or some company to help us internally to develop maybe some of our stakeholders, or even more so our suppliers themselves. And so that's really how we look at it from a partnership standpoint. But again, everything is to move forward to get to the final goal and what that impact is going to be about.
That's a perfect analogy, and I love the idea and the emphasis on the support there as well, because people make mistakes. It's a learning job for everyone, and as you were saying, Javette, there's a lot of new things coming online, and that's where I'd like to go next if I can, because regulations, regulatory frameworks, industry standards, my goodness, that's an area that's moving quickly at the moment. There's a lot for people to keep up with. I can feel the knowing nods coming from the audience through that screen over there. Javette, I'll start with you, as it was something you were mentioning on several occasions there. For you, with all the regulatory frameworks and industry standards, they're changing, they're moving, they're getting tougher. How do you feel they're influencing company sustainability efforts within their supply chains? Because people want to stay ahead of these regulations. They don't just want to be compliant. If you're compliant, you're behind. You want to be pushing ahead and not having to chase these regulations. How do you go about doing that?
I think for us so far, it goes back to one of the things we've talked about, really taking a look at internally, who are your partners first? And so that is working with legal, that is working even with your audit team and others who are starting to look at, take a fresh perspective on what does risk look like? What do the environmental considerations look like? What is the social impact of environmental social governance? Again, going back to all the locations where we are across the world, how are we taking care of the communities, our suppliers, and our customers? How do we all work together? And so then taking a look at, well, where are we doing business? Then what's the impact as it relates to supplier diversity, as in terms of looking at diverse suppliers, we do business across the globe. But then again, back to modern slavery, human right, forced labor, what's happening in our supply chain when we're purchasing goods and services, whether it is a computer or telephones, et cetera, what's happening when those things leave, when we're done with them. So really taking a look at where's the impact of the things that we are purchasing, the goods and services that we're utilizing. Who are we purchasing them from? Do they understand what their local laws and customs are as it relates to these things that we say are important to us from a supply chain perspective? And then as it relates to legal considerations as well, let's make sure that we're not just doing the right things, but we're doing things that do make an impact and that leave a good impact wherever it is we're doing business. And that does come with having to have conversation and dialogue internally, having to have working groups and or discussions with your suppliers so that they understand what is important to, in this case, a city group. What's important to us, this is what we need you to understand. Here's what we're asking. Here's how it relates to a document you might have already seen, as example, requirements for suppliers. And then, so if you understand our requirements for suppliers, then We also want you to understand the statement of supplier principles and the things that we're seeing that are important to us. And then really trying to ask our suppliers as it relates to, let's say, internally work with the business activity owners, making sure that they understand too, this may be a great supplier that you've done business with for 10 or 20 years, but make sure that in your business discussions, as we choose them from a sourcing perspective, that they do understand what it means to be in sync and to ensure the safety and soundness of their operation, but certainly their operation as it relates to us. So I think, again, it's just that all the things we've talked about already, integration, collaboration, clarity, education, training, and awareness, and then being goal-oriented and definitive about what it is you believe your needs are to, one, make an impact, but certainly to ensure that you eliminate and prevent risk.
And I loved your turn of phrase there about not just doing the right thing, but wanting to actually have an impact. It's going that bit further, not just ticking the box, making sure you're doing all you can do in the best terms you can. Thank you, Javette. Madison, we'll come to you next on this. Those regulations, again, I saw a smile when we started mentioning these. How do you stay ahead of them? For you, how do you approach that?
Well, it's no secret that they are coming out of everywhere these days. And I were talking about them today earlier. We're seeing things that we've never seen before, and it's sometimes it's really hard. Like I said, this is a big job. It's really hard to predict things, but what we have been able to do is look at what we currently have from policies and procedures, and as we apply those across the board, we try to be proactive in looking at what would be something that would be next. You know, what would be something that be covering not only what is being required at this point, but be proactively as we see it, and then move that through the business to get approval and for running moving forward. And those are the biggest things that we have as jobs to do, is because unfortunately we don't have crystal balls. We don't know what next year will hold. We can predict and we can try to prepare, but for the most part, you know, we're seeing things today that 2 years ago weren't really even on our minds. If they were just kind of like, well, what ifs? So that's kind of how we look at it.
Yeah, what will be next? That's exactly what we're talking about here. Chanda and Trahan, will come to you next on this as well. Again, your thoughts on regulations and staying ahead of that game.
I think one of the biggest thing that we have to understand around this is try to have your heart at the right place. Make sure that you're not just ticking the box like Javed said. The idea is not just to become compliant, but also to make sure that the impact that you are trying to create is actually realized on the ground. The other big thing that I believe that these kind of regulatory frameworks, and like Madison said, they're coming out of everywhere. It's an alphabet soup. If you really look at it, so many, a small supplier working from, say, a region like India and trying to sell into, say, Europe, there are at least 4 different regulations only from the regulatory standpoint that have to be complied to. Now, one of the things that we have to also look at this entire mayhem is to understand that these are expected to provide some level of standardization. If it wasn't for these things, it does not necessarily, it does not tell anybody what does it mean in terms of, I'm sustainable. So when these rules and laws and regulatory frameworks are put in, the idea is to show that, yes, when I say that I'm sustainable, are you sustainable in, say, scope 2 emissions, or are you sustainable in scope 3 emission, and which, by the way, has got a global definition, and everybody now understands that. So as a consumer also, it empowers. So if you have your heart in the right place, making sure that your consumers are fed with the right information, and you don't just try to check the box, you will definitely be ahead of this regulatory problems.
Thank you, Chandan. Where I'd like to go next is I'm very much in the market for some examples and some case studies. So, Madison, I'm going to warn you, I'm coming to you first with this one so you can get thinking. We've talked on very broad terms about a lot of these issues. What I'd love to do now is to, shameless plug away. We want to know some of the best examples you have seen either internally, with partners, anything else you have seen in the industry of really, really inspiring examples and successful initiatives that have improved supply chain sustainability and resilience. Things you've seen, it could be from the smallest project to the biggest multinational program, anything that has made you stop and think, wow, and if it wasn't your idea, wishing it was. Madison, I'll come to you first.
Sure. I think one of the things that we've prided ourselves on for the last year and a half, we were one of the first companies to produce an exhibit, which was basically a how-to from a sustainability standpoint for all of our suppliers. Of course, we didn't try to boil the ocean and go to all of our suppliers at one point, but we segmented those suppliers and then really went after what we considered our strategic suppliers first. And then there's a litany for that definition that I won't get into, but we went after that. Here's the beauty of that all was that when we defined what that meant to be a supplier, a long-term strategic supplier, and the areas of sustainability that we wanted you to support, whether it be net zero or reducing your carbon footprint, whatever that may have held, and there is a lot that holds there. What we did was we understood that our supply chain is not all in the same place. And no one here can say that. None of us here can clearly say that each one of our suppliers are all at the same level. So it's important when you do something like that, and what we did is we also identified a mechanism, actually a number of mechanisms, that came from playbooks to all the way down to consulting support partners that would help our suppliers get to where the goals we wanted them to get to within the next year, 2 years, 3 years as a whole. I think that those are tenements of good practice that helps the supply chain eventually get to where they want to go. And that has been probably the most resound case that we've had so far. And it has, I could tell you, I probably have, if I've had one, I've had 20 times where that business case was talked about. So I would say I would rest my laurels on that one being the most prominent.
That's a fine example. Chandan Trahan at Bosch will come to you next for this. You've had a little bit of time to collect your thoughts. A fine example you'd like to provide.
I think, like you rightly said, this is, unfortunately, this is not my idea, and I really wish it was mine. We came up with a concept internally of a control tower where we were trying to build multiple aspects of supply chain and make them visible on a single glass pane view. And we extended that solution to make sure that there is an integration of your ERP systems with your MES systems, with your PLM systems. We wanted to make sure that all the smart meters, the IoT devices that are there on our shop floors get integrated and feed all that data on a single data lake, which acts as a single source of truth for us to start building intelligence on top of that. So all your water, air, gas, energy, steam data. Now, the good part of this is it is going to set the baselines for you. And once you have those baselines clearly identified, you can actually go about identifying use cases, identifying small projects. We call them lighthouse projects that can help you significantly reduce the usage of these things. We are planning to now integrate that with some of our supplier data as well to add the ethical component of this as well, so that we have clear provenance, clear visibility of the global supply chain. So definitely one place where we saw technology play a very critical role. I'm a huge fan of technology, so that was one place where we saw we could create some significant impact.
A great program. Might not be your idea, but claim some collective corporate responsibility for that one. I don't think they'll hold it against you because you flagged it up. And Javette, I'll come to you last on this one. I have no idea where time has gone. We are running out of time very rapidly, but we'd love to hear your example to close with.
So just very quickly, I think two things. To me, it just goes back to education, training, and development, and then just best practices, utilizing your partners. So for diverse suppliers, and particularly years ago, we started with hosting some sustainability symposiums to ensure that they understood the direction of where, at the time, corporate social responsibility was going. And then so by the time we started saying ESG, there was a better understanding of everyone understanding where it fit with them. But then during the pandemic and post-pandemic, we started best practices sessions. So all suppliers, a bottom line series where we talk about environmental, social governance and the things that are important to us. But then the best practice series, working with our other peers and partners in other corporations, but also inviting the ILO, UN Global Compact, and others to share as a part of those best practice sessions so that everyone is getting the same information, not just in the supply chain, but we opened it up and continue to open it up to others within the firm as a part of our learning and best practices series.
Wonderful, Javette. Thank you very much indeed. And as I said, I've absolutely no idea where the time has gone. This has absolutely flown by. We could probably carry on for another half an hour. There's so many things I didn't get to. We'll just have to do it again next year. Anyway, thank you all so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this one, really enjoyed your company, and thank you so much for joining us at Procurement and Supply Chain Live New York.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you.